In 1946, the world was still rebuilding from World War II. Europe lay in ruins, the colonies were restless, and the age of empire was dying. But in the Far East, one empire tried to rise again. France, exhausted, humiliated by Nazi occupation, was determined to rebuild its glory overseas. And at the heart of that dream was Indochina, a territory made up of Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, once known as the Pearl of the French Empire. But France wasn't returning to an empty colony. A new force had risen. The Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, who had fought the Japanese during the war and now demanded independence. What began as tense negotiations soon exploded into open war, a brutal conflict that would last 8 years and eventually drag the world's superpowers into the jungles of Vietnam. This is the story of how it all began: Haiphong, Hanoi, and Operation Léa, the war France tried to forget. Before World War II, French Indochina had been one of the jewels of the empire. The French ruled from Saigon and Hanoi, controlling trade, agriculture, and resources, especially rice, rubber, and coal. But when France fell to Germany in 1940, its colonies came under Vichy control, and then, in 1941, were occupied by Japan. During those years, the Viet Minh, a nationalist movement founded by Ho Chi Minh, rose in the shadows. They fought both the Japanese and the French Vichy administrators, building a disciplined guerrilla force. When Japan surrendered in 1945, the Viet Minh seized their moment. On September 2, 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a massive crowd in Hanoi and declared the creation of the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. He quoted directly from the U.S. Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal. They are endowed with certain inalienable rights." For a brief moment, Vietnam was free, but France had other plans. After Japan's defeat, Allied forces divided Indochina for disarmament purposes. The Chinese nationalists occupied the north, the British occupied the south. And when the British arrived in Saigon, they immediately released French prisoners of war and rearmed them. Soon, French troops were back on the streets. In the south, clashes erupted between the French and Vietnamese nationalists. By the end of 1945, the British withdrew, and France was back in control of southern Vietnam. In the north, Ho Chi Minh sought compromise. He needed time to rebuild, and the French were still weak. So in March 1946, both sides signed a peace agreement. France would recognize Vietnam as a free state within the French Union, in theory, giving it autonomy. But in reality, both sides were preparing for war. The French wanted to restore full control. The Viet Minh wanted total independence, and all it would take was a spark. The spark came in the northern port city of Haiphong, a bustling harbor vital for trade and supplies. In November 1946, a dispute broke out over customs duties between the French authorities and local Vietnamese officials. Tensions escalated when a French patrol boat seized a Chinese junk suspected of smuggling. Gunfire followed, and several French soldiers were killed. The French commander in the north, Admiral Georges Thierry d'Argenlieu, decided to make an example. On November 23, 1946, French warships opened fire on Haiphong. For hours, shells rained down on the city. Entire neighborhoods burned. Thousands of civilians were trapped in their homes. When it was over, an estimated 6,000 Vietnamese civilians were dead. Haiphong was in ruins. The French called it a police action. The Vietnamese called it a massacre. For the Viet Minh, This was the breaking point. Ho Chi Minh's hopes for negotiation vanished in the smoke. The message was clear. The French had come not to cooperate, but to conquer. 3 weeks later, on December 19th, 1946, the war officially began. At 8 p.m., the lights went out across Hanoi. Moments later, explosions echoed through the city. Viet Minh forces attacked French positions in a coordinated uprising, destroying bridges, telephone lines, and barracks. The French garrison fought back fiercely, but the fighting spread to every street. Civilians fled as artillery and mortars turned Hanoi into chaos. For 2 months, the Viet Minh fought house to house, but by February 1947, they were forced to withdraw into the countryside, taking their weapons and their cause with them. The French had retaken Hanoi, but the victory was hollow, because the war was no longer about cities. It was about the jungles, the villages, and the hearts of the Vietnamese people. The First Indochina War had begun. By 1947, the French controlled the major cities, Hanoi, Haiphong, and Saigon, but the Viet Minh dominated the countryside. They had retreated to the remote northern mountains near the Chinese border, in a region known as Bac Can, where Ho Chi Minh and General Vo Nguyen Giap built hidden bases and supply lines. To destroy the movement once and for all, the French launched a massive operation, Operation Léa. The plan was bold. Paratroopers would drop directly on Bac Can to capture Ho Chi Minh himself. Infantry columns would advance from 3 directions to encircle the area. On October 7th, 1947, the operation began. Over 3,000 French paratroopers dropped into the jungle, catching the Viet Minh completely by surprise. For a few hours, it looked like France might end the war in one strike. But Giap and Ho Chi Minh escaped, slipping through the forest just minutes before capture. Then, the French advance bogged down. Viet Minh ambushes cut supply lines. The jungle swallowed vehicles whole. The French suffered heavy losses and eventually withdrew. Operation Léa had failed. Ho Chi Minh lived, and his movement emerged stronger than ever. The French had learned what every empire would learn in Vietnam. You can win the battles, but lose the war. After the failure of Operation Léa, the war entered a deadlock. The French built fortified outposts and launched patrols, but they couldn't control the countryside. The Viet Minh used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, sabotage, and hit-and-run attacks. In 1949, the balance shifted again. Across the border, China fell to Mao Zedong's communists, and suddenly the Viet Minh had a powerful new ally. From that moment, weapons, supplies, and training flowed across the border. The French, meanwhile, struggled to justify the war back home. It was expensive, unpopular, and politically toxic, but they couldn't leave. To them, losing Indochina meant losing prestige, the final symbol of France's global power. So the war dragged on, a slow, grinding struggle between a colonial army and a nationalist movement that refused to die. By 1950, it was no longer just a colonial war. It had become part of the Cold War. The United States began supplying money and weapons to France, fearing the spread of communism in Asia. China and the Soviet Union backed the Viet Minh. The stage was set for a much larger conflict, one that would culminate in Dien Bien Phu in 1954, and then decades later in the Vietnam War itself. But it all started here, in the fires of Haiphong, the streets of Hanoi, and the jungles of Bac Can. The war France tried to forget was the war that changed Vietnam forever. Now, some interesting facts about the early Indochina War you might not know. The French Expeditionary Corps in Indochina never numbered more than 250,000 troops, including many from Algeria, Morocco, and Senegal. The Haiphong bombardment on November 23, 1946, killed between 6,000 and 10,000 civilians, though the exact number is still debated. Ho Chi Minh had once lived in France and even worked as a cook on a French steamship before becoming a revolutionary. During Operation Léa, French intelligence believed they were only a few kilometers away from capturing Ho Chi Minh, but he escaped by traveling through a secret cave system in the jungle. The Viet Minh began producing their own weapons in underground workshops, including rifles and grenades made from scrap metal. The French relied heavily on river patrols, small armored boats navigating the Red River and Mekong Delta. Many of the same officers and units who fought in Indochina would later serve again in Algeria, facing another guerrilla war for independence. The first use of napalm in Vietnam was by the French, years before the Americans arrived. The First Indochina War began as a colonial police action and ended as a war for survival. For France, it was a tragedy, a painful reminder that the age of empire was over. For Vietnam, it was the birth of a nation, a revolution forged in blood and fire. And for the world, it was a warning that no empire, however proud, can hold back the tide of independence forever. The war France tried to forget would be remembered by history as the beginning of one of the longest, most defining struggles of the 20th century. Thank you for watching this video, the story of how a forgotten war began in the ashes of empire. If you enjoyed this cinematic retelling and want to explore more easy-to-understand history, please like, subscribe, and turn on the bell to support the channel. You can also check out my other videos like the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, the Rhodesian Bush War, or the Korean War for more stories about courage, collapse, and the cost of empire. This was the war France tried to forget. How it all began, 1946 to 47, the beginning of a revolution and the end of an empire.